Hi, I'm Betty Wilde-Biasiny. I'm happy to be invited to talk about the Critical Mass newsletter, which is part of Enfoco. My current role is as a professor of art at SUNY Empire State University. Before coming to academia, I worked for many years in the community arts development world. I was a curator at the Bronx Museum of the Arts. I think that's where I met Charles Biasiny Rivera, who I eventually married. And that's how I became involved with Enfoco. I actually worked for Enfoco for 10 years, officially, perhaps more than that, unofficially. And my role at the time, I brought my curatorial background into developing the traveling art exhibitions, where we placed solo exhibitions of mostly Latino and community-based artists throughout community sites in the Bronx. The newsletter began as a way to announce what we called the Critical Mass Seminars. So the basis of Enfoco being a collective meant that its members, or its people who would meet together, wanted to continue that tradition. So I think Charlie set up the newsletter at first to announce the monthly meetings, and it became clear to Charlie and his kind of colleagues and peers that there were so many opportunities that were not being publicized. Enfoco would always publicize the due date for the New York Foundation for the Arts Fellowship in Photography. Who knew? There were photography open calls across the country. I think Blue Sky was an early collaborator with Enfoco to reach out for photographers that may not have had access to these kind of listings. The newsletter was our way of informing people of exhibitions, grants, any number of opportunities that were not really too accessible to even anyone. So targeting the audience of Latino photographers and ultimately photographers of color and Bronx photographers. The newsletter was an ongoing microphone for all the activities of Enfoco. And it also served to document its funded activities. So one thing I can think of is that Enfoco began to receive more funding to do larger exhibitions outside of the community galleries. So there were curated shows at Lehman College Art Gallery, Hostos Center for the Arts and Culture, Art in General, the Department of Cultural Affairs. And then the staff started creating traveling versions of these shows. There were articles on the traveling gallery exhibitions, which I really loved. I headed that up for many years. So the exhibitions were not only an excellent experience for the photographers, but having a story written about their work in the Critical Mass newsletter was the beginning of really critical review for many of the photographers. So their work was taken seriously. I love to write, so I would love to write stories that were like curatorial texts in the Critical Mass newsletter, and then the photographers would have a document, kind of giving additional credibility to their body of work because someone had written about it. So I think the newsletter was pivotal in showing how serious the community gallery shows were at the time and how important the work was and is. And it led to larger projects. The way that the newsletter served its audience, its photographers, was kind of twofold. There were opportunities that only someone like Wilde-Biasiny and his staff would have had the patience to go through, the stack of information coming in. And also, as a not-for-profit organization, NFOCO did have access to a community of photographers, artists, people across the nation, and then ultimately internationally. So it was really a willingness to share this information to the community. It also was an opportunity for other organizations to reach out to audiences and talent that they were not necessarily reaching in a very insulated art world of the 70s and the 80s. Things started to crack a little bit, but there was still a real dichotomy between the quote unquote community artists and the art world, quote unquote. And I think that the newsletter was a egalitarian vehicle for bringing opportunities to more people. It was a fairly direct idea, and it did work because the photographers began to get grants. They began to be included in exhibitions that were not necessarily driven by their, ethnicity. At the same time, they created a openness to the idea of ethnicity as a rich content for a curator to draw upon. So it was a real exchange, I think, of all different kinds of opportunities, including commercial ones. Some of our photographers were at the time called working photographers, meaning they earned a living with their photography, and of course, many still do. It was less common for the artists in the NFOCO community to have opportunities to grow artistically because, for whatever reason, it was not so common to, say, earn a living as an artist photographer and become part of the network of photographers that showed their work, sold their work. So it was an opening of those kind of opportunities as well. When Kim Bacadero Rose gave me the link to the critical mass scans on the website, I really was almost in tears because it was this amazing timeline of all these activities that NFOCO had sponsored. And from a show at the Fordham Library to an exhibition at Art in General, which was a wonderful space in Tribeca, which is still there. So it was really a testament to Charlie's work, and I felt it was an amazing document. Memories of putting the zip code labels on the newsletter and putting them into the zip code bags and hauling them down to the post office made me laugh. Now, at the time, it was not funny. It was kind of an organic process. We used to have piles and piles of press releases, newsletters, gallery announcements that would just kind of accumulate in the office. And we would all go through them and we used to circle opportunities and just, compile an ongoing, I think we typed it, on a real typewriter. And the process involved taking the typed version to a typesetter, which was kind of a 19th century setup of a wonderful typesetter named Armand Ortiz. And so Frankie Paya, who's still very much part of NFOCO today, would create boards that were compiled out of columns, pictures, and somehow it all got printed into a cohesive document. Yes, it was put together with rubber cement. We didn't have computers at first. And I'll never forget dragging the zip code bags of mail to the post office, and it was like in this dreary dungeon-like spot at 149th Street. And there was always one or two bags that had to be completely redone. So Charlie and I got to do that. Team efforts were, I think, part of what making us laugh kept us going, because it was a really hard job. Results of having that kind of community can be very powerful, because the people who interact with each other and get support from each other is an invaluable seed that is planted in other communities. So Enfoco began to interact with national communities of Chicano photographers. Some of its photographers began showing in Photo Fest in the 80s and 90s. That was a big festival of international photography held in Houston. So communities that connect with other communities are powerful in that they begin to forge an aesthetic that is looked upon and becomes known. So community is a dynamic concept. And I think Charlie and his colleagues, his friends, his peers understood that, and it became a very powerful tool for moving a new kind of photography into the forefront. I think the newsletter was the seed that started a lot of the momentum and activity and support. So in that way, it served a huge purpose, and it's, for me, ironic today that the newsletter is still included in Nueva Luz, and galleries want to pay for ads in the newsletter, which in turn continues to support our photographers. So I just thought that was great. It's very rewarding, and it really shows how important documentation and archival material for communities of color is pivotal to their work being preserved, recognized, and remembered. And the Critical Mass newsletter, I think in its original concept, is still a vital idea. That is, get information in the hands of photographers, make opportunities accessible, and document their good work so many more people can become aware of it. I think there's of late been recognition by major funding sources to go back in and open up files and boxes and find these artifacts and documents of what was a burgeoning art community in the 70s that is still underdocumented. And it's really so significant that Enfoco took on this project to document Nueva Luz, Critical Mass, all of its catalog exhibitions. And these are documents that now become accessible for scholars and academics and the general public to kind of open up the box of amazing photographic talent and accomplishment. And there's so much room for growth in that I think Enfoco is a leader in having figured out that documentation is important, both for academic reasons and for social and cultural reasons. The idea that Enfoco is still committed to taking every single newsletter and scanning it and making it accessible is very heartwarming, because a lot of time and thought did go into it, and now it can continue to help tell the story of Enfoco and its artists, photographers.